pronounced Gaillardetzs. And when I took spiritual preaching in seminary, our reading included his book, Transforming Our Days, Finding God Amidst the Noise of Modern Life. I think it's worthy to share reflections here. Dr. Gaillardetzs is a professor of Catholic studies at the University of Toledo. His reflections were at times difficult for me to understand because he fundamentally uses the Trinity to talk about God in our modern lives. It can be easy for a Unitarian to dismiss talk about how the holy emanates from God through the Word into the Spirit and into our world. But even though his theology is fundamentally different than ours, Dr. Gaillardetzs, I'm going to have trouble with that through the entire sermon, so enjoy it. Dr. Gaillardetzs has some important reflections for Unitarian Universalists. Where Gaillardetzs sees God and the Holy Spirit hidden amidst the noise of modern life, I will try to connect to more Unitarian Universalist ideas through the words of James Luther Adams, my favorite New Youth theologian, and Reverend Kenneth Patton, my humanist childhood minister. To give you an idea of what seems important in Dr. Gaillardetzs' work, here's a passage from his preface. As our family began to grow, my wife Diana and I have 4 sons, and our lives became more hectic, I gradually sensed a change in the ecology of our family. Was it the purchase of the 2nd TV set, the 3rd home computer, the DVD player, the Xbox video game, high-speed internet, or the 4 cell phones for the family members? I do remember ruminating about my purchase of a cookbook entitled 30-Minute Meals and feeling relatively guilty about saying that I had baked bread when in fact I was using an automated bread-making machine. All I know is that despite the shared commitment of my wife and I to our vocation as parents, something precious seemed to be seeping out of our family life. Yet even as I knew that this changing ecology was in some way connected to the technological shape of our lives, a radical repudiation of technology seemed both foolish and futile. What Dr. Gaillardetzs, a man who had devoted his life to spiritual and faithful reflection, had noticed in his home was that something was slipping away amidst the noise introduced by technology. Cooking meals were more rushed. Time spent talking was replaced by time sharing TV shows together. People ate on the go instead of sitting together, and it was not as if some insidious technical villain could be directly blamed. Most of the technology was desired and useful. Anyone who has called their teenager after curfew on the cell phone they carry to tell them to get home right now, or who has managed to serve up a nutritious meal within 30 minutes and then make it to that church committee meeting on time, knows full well the benefit of technology in the home. And who can resist television about Vikings, World War II, and people being dropped off in the wilderness to survive on their own? No, what Gaillardetzs had noticed was not that technology was evil in his life, but that something about it was sapping away some sense of community in his family and some sense of grace and connectedness. Yeah?
I'm really sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
There's a silver Honda Accord that's parked just right next to the grass here, and we're having water day out there and sprinklers are going and it has a window open, and so it's a problem. So if that's your car, please go out there and move it if you can. So, sorry about the interruption.
No, thank you for interrupting for that. Yeah, if somebody has a silver Honda Accord, now's the time to get up and go check if it's yours. COO license plate something? Okay. Your seat will be wet. I think that was pretty clear. Your seat will be wet. So no, what Gaillardetzs had noticed was not that technology was evil, but that some sense of community in his family, some sense of grace and connectedness was seeping away. He identifies that gradually escaping presence as the Holy Spirit. Reverend Ken Patton, in Man's Hidden Search, hidden search, as if everyone searching for meaning was male, right? I'll ask you instead to join me in longing that we could edit the texts of the past to share more inclusive language we've adopted today. And I hope to look at Patton's meaning instead of his language. And in fact, in the quotes I use, I've replaced his use of man with people. So Patton wrote, when people of every style of worldview stand in need of emotional deepening, a profundation of experience. Some people struggle for spiritual elevation and union with a divine being. Others strive for fuller realization of human togetherness, of each person's unity with nature as a child of earth, or for the emotional significance of new knowledge and experience. What Reverend Patton was articulating is, I think, that same sense of connectedness that Gaillarde was noticing slipping away. A sense of unity, a natural sense of presence that he doesn't identify as the Holy Spirit or as anything specific in any sacred language, but as unique to each person. Now, for a Unitarian theist, that sense of reverent and connectedness is not God's Holy Spirit, but God. James Luther Adams writes, to be sure, the word God is so heavily laden with unacceptable connotations that it is, for many people, scarcely usable without confusion. James Luther Adams goes on to define God as the inescapable, commanding reality that sustains and transforms all meaningful existence. For Adams, God is that reality which works upon us and through us, and in accord with which we can achieve truth, beauty, or goodness. So what Dr. Gaillarde saw slipping away from his family was that sense of something reverential, sacred, what humanist Ken Patton might define as the hidden search and longing for meaning in each person's being, or what theist James Luther Adams in his process theology might say is God. However we conceptualize it, I think that mysterious thing that Dr. Gaillarde saw slipping away from his family is something that most of us can feel or have felt in some form or another. It's that mysterious sense of something greater than ourselves in creation that moves us, connects us, uplifts us. And it was slipping away in the modern noise of Dr. Gaillarde's family. I invite you now to think about your own family, your career, your workplace, your friendships, and think about how they're impacted by the pace and noise of the modern world. I hope some of you can appreciate what Dr. Gaillarde saw, and the insight and cleverness it takes to notice. Dr. Gaillarde writes in his first chapter, technology's ability to influence us so profoundly lies in its pervasive hiddenness. We are often blind to the subtle way it shapes our view of and our interaction with our world. There's several ways that he describes technology as altering how we experience the world. He first introduces Albert Borgmann's division of devices and focal things. I really like this. He asks us to consider the role and the place of a wood-burning fireplace or stove in a pre-modern home. Family would gather around a fireplace as a local source for heat, discussion, and entertainment. The fire would be tended, requiring a mastery of certain skills, which would put people in touch with the natural world, and which would have to be passed from one generation to another. It is what Borgmann would identify as a focal thing, a thing that is inseparable from its contexts, meaning, and around which we as people gather. Food is another example of a focal thing. In the preparation of a meal, one must leave the home to gather ingredients. There is a set of embedded skills, such as knowing how to select ripe vegetables and fruits, and what seasonings might be required. Food preparation includes various acts that are often shared among family members, such as cutting vegetables, setting the table, and cleaning up afterwards. As Dr. Gaillarde writes, meals such as these are focal because in diverse ways they gather our attention and hold us in patterns of meaningful engagement with others, and with the fruits of the earth. Now, in contrast, a technological device, according to Boardman, provides the same commodity as a focal thing, but without the elements of gathering and attention focusing. The example that Dr. Gaillardetzs cites is the central heating system. It provides the same results as a wood-burning stove, and even does so with more efficiency. It's placed out of sight and runs virtually on its own. Instead of a set of systemic skills passed from generation to generation, it's maintained and repaired by technical specialists. And it does not require us to connect with the earth to gather and prepare the correct types of wood to burn. Similarly, the technology of the food industry has changed the focal nature of the way we prepare food. Those instant recipes and prepackaged food are very useful. There's nothing wrong with them. What Boardman points out is that they no longer require us to share the same skills and time together. As Dr. Gaillardetzs writes, a basic thesis of Boardman's work is that the technological device has become such a pervasive part of our culture that it has now become a paradigm. That is, it presents a consistent and patterned framework in and through which people encounter the world. So it's not that technological devices are necessarily bad. I'm not preaching against technology. It's that they rob our focal practices and we hardly notice. Reflecting upon leisure, Dr. Gaillardetzs notices that the introduction of television into the living rooms of North Americans was more than the addition of a device. It reshaped the way Americans look at leisure and entertainment. Couches and chairs are often oriented towards the television instead of towards each other. What Dr. Gaillardetzs and Boardman note is that these changes, while not necessarily bad, they do point to the importance of preserving human engagement and focal practices. Dr. Gaillardetzs connects this idea to communion, and in that connection with the sacred, focal things bring communion, and technological devices do not. Reverend Ken Patton talks about the latent sense of importance in us, the importance to us of our own lives and the welfare of others, the importance of soil and its creatures, the importance of time and the things of time. Reverend Patton also notes that no one can learn for another, no one, and asks the question, who would replace the name of a flower for the sight of a flower? Reverend Patton's naturalist and humanist ideas are commiserate with that sense of integration, practice, embedded skills, heritage, sharing, natural presence found in focal things. It's the same sense of connection that Dr. Gaillardetzs calls communion. Gaillardetzs also writes about hyperreality. Hyperreality has several characteristics. It's brilliant in that it highlights all the desired characteristics while excluding the unwanted ones. It's rich in that the experience is more useful towards a purpose than the real one. And it's pliable in that we can manipulate and control it. The quintessential example of hyperreality is simulators. The flight simulators that we use to train pilots, the combat simulators we use to train military personnel, the driving simulators that our students learn on in high schools. In many ways, we could even consider grocery stores as a hyper-real representation of the gathering process human beings have used to collect food for most of our existence. Hyperreality also includes the mastery of time. The influence of the clock in Western culture is ironically tied to the use of water clocks and sundials to call monks to prayer. So the original scheduling and planning was monastic. And with the invention of mechanical clocks, we were able to separate time from our internal sense of it, such as our heartbeats, our breathing, and from external measures such as the movement of the sun or the annual season changes. Once we can measure time apart from internal indicators or external factors, time is under our control, and we can make the most of our time or manage our time wisely. How many of us can still feel our heartbeat in our chest and use it to tell the passage of time. Such is the paradox of the hyperreal age. We're trapped in a spiral to purchase more devices, lured by the promise that they will save us time. Fortunately, we get to bank our time for future enjoyment, right? Another reflection Dr. Gaillardetzs shares is computers have added to hyperreality a concept of multitasking, juggling numerous tasks simultaneously. Now we can toggle back and forth between tasks, and our mastery of time has so grown that we can even do more than one thing at a time. We can drive and talk on the phone. Better yet, we can text and drive. Dr. Gaillardetzs writes, to the extent that our technological world encourages multitasking or juggling, the cramming of greater productivity into discrete units of time, it blinds us to the possibility of multidimensionality, the capacity to experience the flow of time as yielding some only gradually emerging cumulative insight into the narrative of our world. Wow. Gradually emerging cumulative insight into the narrative of our world. That sounds pretty good. Since I work in a hospital, I'm reminded of the idea that a nursing ratio of 5, 6, or 7 to 1 is appropriate. And then we wonder why our patients feel alone and unsatisfied at times in our healthcare. So another reflection I find really insightful in Gaillardetz's work is the culture of simulation. Areas of daily life where the hyper-real has become so taken for granted that the distinction between the real and the hyper-real is blurred or gone completely. My favorite example he gives is Disney. Disney is the unparalleled master of creating hyper-real themed resorts. The Wilderness Lodge, for example, where we go to experience the wilds of creation with the convenient devices of central heating and prepared food. Excluded from the lodge are the dangers of unpredictable wild animals and unplowed, unpaved roads that might break or damage a car. Geysers erupt on planned intervals, demonstrating our mastery of time. Now, this is not to diminish the entertainment and leisure value of Disney, but perhaps it would behoove us to admit that such Disney projects technically blur our sense of what is natural. My wife has pointed out and noted to me that during trips to Yellowstone National Park, she's talked with park rangers about families and people complaining that the geysers will not erupt on time. Reverend Ken Patton writes, how pitiful are the words and forms in which we try to replace our experience for another's living reality. Words, our own or another's, can never be more than a commentary on experience. Reverend Patton in 1954 did not yet have the concepts we have today, from computers and simulators. The television show Disneyland didn't even air until in 1954, and the first park didn't open until 1955. And yet, Reverend Patton, in his exploration of naturalistic mysticism, was already starting to articulate that simulation is not the same as creation itself. Creation is original. Our focal things are original. The engagement that they encourage us to is original. So what are we to do? Such insidious, hidden, unexpected shifts in our basic understanding of the world. I don't know about the rest of you, but some of these reflections make me a bit angry. I have to admit, I like my simulated World of Warcraft. And a trip to the zoo to see tigers is a lot safer for me than a trip to their natural habitat. And there's no way that I'm going to give up my cell phone or start huddling around a fireplace for warmth. Utah summers without central air? I don't think so. I feel a tension around some of these ideas. And in fact, the final reflection that Dr. Gaillardetzs shares with us is that friction, tension, is natural and an important part of the depth of our experience. With a fully technological perspective, human experience itself can be truncated. We can express conflict through email or Facebook instead of face-to-face. Think about your experiences with email. How often do you accurately experience the context, the body language, and the non-verbal aspects of the communication? So, technology, devices, and hyperreality are not entirely bad, though. Dr. Gaillardetzs writes, even if I recognize the deleterious impact of technology on my daily life, I must also acknowledge the many benefits it brings. There are advances that, quite frankly, I am not sure I wish to surrender. It is very romantic to think of home-cooked meals every night, gathering around the fireplace and sharing family stories, and leisurely exploring the natural world. The reality is that many of us are overwhelmed trying to make ends meet and are exhausted and struggling to keep up, and we need the advantages those technological devices give us. So what are we to do? Well, instead, Dr. Gaillardetzs suggests, and this is what the rest of his book is devoted to, is that it's futile to try and dismantle the technical paradigm we have today. Instead, we have an opportunity to seek an intentional, realistic, and measured reform. I'm sorry, it just struck me the irony of a Catholic writing that really we ought to reform our understanding of the world instead of revise it or completely throw it out and start over. That just struck me as I was speaking. So instead, we have conscious reflection on our lives, opening space for focal things despite the availability of devices, conscious identification and engagement of what Dr. Gaillardetzs calls communion, what Reverend Patton might call search for a natural sense of being. Dr. Gaillardetzs explores ways in which the Catholic tradition invites Christians into such communion and intentional practice. But such suggestions are useful for Unitarian Universalists and all people as well, such as intentional discernment and preservation of focal things in our lives. Engagement with the natural world, a practice Reverend Patton would encourage. Perhaps less intuitive to us is to embrace the friction and discomfort in relationship. Even to recognize that even in our frustrations and conflicts among one another, there is a natural sense of depth, and one that is necessary for us to live into the richness of creation. Regardless of the belief system that drives us, Reverend Patton writes, the life of each human creature is a long search, most often a search for we do not know quite what. That search for meaning and connectedness amidst the noise of modern life invites us to be intentional in the setting aside of our technical devices, our hyperreality, our simulations, and to look into the natural world around us, to commune with that world and one another. So in doing so, may you find more mystery, wonder, and confusion. Blessings.
Thank you, John. And we also just want to say congratulations for finishing your didactic work in your grad program.